Episode 91. Tonight the veil is thinnest and a storm moves in. Can you hear them howling from the Palatine? Shh, right there. Greetings and welcome into the Pawtuxet General. The children have gotten their candy, the inflatable ghosts have fallen over, and now it's time for the adults to celebrate those who have passed. Eat and drink a few treats, and listen to one more story by Edgar Allan Poe. This time, The Masque of the Red Death. But first, I must thank our Patreon subscribers. These folks are the round table, flickering candles, thumping chairs, ornate feathered fountain pens, leather-bound journal, runes, tarot cards, and whistling wind that is the seance that is the Pawtuxet General, without whom we would be staring numbly at the veil. So thank you! And if you would like to encourage us to look more deeply into history and Pawtuxet in general, please follow the link in the show notes or go to our page on patreon.com. Every donation counts, so thank you. But for right now, let's check out a show-stopping Schwarzwald Martini. This drink is so beautiful I just couldn't resist. From EmpressGin.com, enjoy the Schwarzwald Martini. For the spruce syrup, you will need 200 grams castor sugar and 100 grams spruce tips. Add a small layer of sugar at the base of a jar, followed by a layer of spruce tips. Continue layering until all are used up. Seal and place in a sunny windowsill for 2 weeks until the syrup forms. Invert the jar daily. Strain out the solids and store the syrup in a fridge. For this martini, you will need 35 milliliters Empress 1908 Indigo Gin, 20 milliliters maraschino liquor, 15 milliliters white creme de cacao, 5 milliliters spruce syrup, and 2 dashes of bitters. You will also need chocolate-dipped figs and edible glitter for the garnish. Add the gin, creme de cacao, maraschino liqueur, spruce syrup, and bitters to a mixing glass filled with ice. Stir for 30 seconds to chill and dilute, then strain into a chilled martini glass. Serve garnished with chocolate-dipped figs and edible glitter for a journey across the Black Forest with this moody yet decadent spirit-forward delight. Enjoy. The second part of our Halloween spectacular is about the week after Halloween. According to many beliefs, the veil is still very thin. Among others, we checked out azcentral.com for information about Dia de los Muertos and Yvette Marquez about the delectable Pineapple Empanadas. In preparation for the holiday, sometimes weeks in advance, celebrants prepare an altar or ofrendas, either in their home or at the gravesite, or both. The graves are often covered with marigolds to draw the spirit back to the grave, to walk amongst the living on these few days a year. The ofrendas are made to show respect to the ancestors and loved ones who have passed, with offerings of food, drink, sugar skulls, and marigolds to draw the spirits in. On November 2nd, the adults are celebrated. Loved ones enjoy music, food, drinks, and remember the lives with joy and love. And in this spirit, let us enjoy and share baked pineapple empanadas. Making Mexican empanadas is a bit of a labor of love, but once you start going, they're so easy. Here are some tips and tricks to make sure yours come out perfectly every time. Don't overwork the dough. Once the ingredients come together in a single pliable dough, leave it alone. Rest the dough. This allows the gluten strands to relax, which makes it easier to roll out. Cool your filling so that it doesn't cause the dough to become too soft to handle. Make sure your filling isn't too chunky, otherwise they're hard to fold without breaking the dough open. Refrigerate leftover baked empanadas for up to 3 to 5 days. Reheat in a toaster oven or bake at 350 degrees for 8 minutes. Work ahead of time. Make and freeze the pineapple filling for up to 3 months ahead of time. Assemble the empanadas without brushing them with egg wash and freeze them for up to 2 months. For the pineapple filling, you will need 1 20-ounce can pineapple tidbits, 1 20-ounce can crushed pineapple, both drained of the juice, but please reserve it. 1/8 teaspoon ground nutmeg, 1/8 teaspoon ground ginger, 1/4 teaspoon ground cinnamon, 1 cup granulated sugar, the reserved pineapple juice, and 3 tablespoons of cornstarch. For the empanada dough, you will need 3 cups all-purpose flour, 2 teaspoons baking powder, 1/2 teaspoon salt, 2 tablespoons granulated sugar, 1 teaspoon cinnamon, 1/2 cup shortening, 2 eggs, and 1/2 cup of milk. For the glaze, you will need 1 egg and some raw sugar. For the pineapple filling, in a saucepan, combine the drained tidbits, drained crushed pineapple, nutmeg, ginger, cinnamon, sugar, and 3/4 cup of the reserved juice. Stir the ingredients and bring them to a boil, then simmer on low for 45 minutes. Remove about 1/3 cup of the liquid from the saucepan, reserve it, and let it cool. In a bowl, combine the cornstarch with the cooled cup of liquid and stir. Pour back into the mixture to thicken the filling. Stir and simmer for an additional 10 minutes to a thickened consistency of preserves. If runny, add an additional tablespoon of cornstarch combined with 1/8 cup of reserved juice and simmer mixture for an additional 5 minutes. Make the empanada dough after your filling has chilled. For the empanada dough, in a stand mixer, add the first 5 dry ingredients and combine on low. Add in the shortening and then combine. In a separate bowl, whisk the eggs and milk and combine with dry ingredients. Continue to mix until you have a soft dough. Knead the dough and split the dough in half. Wrap in plastic wrap and refrigerate for about 20 to 30 minutes. Preheat your oven to 350 degrees Fahrenheit. Then take out the dough and split it into 12 equal balls of dough. On a floured surface, roll out the dough balls into small round circles and place a small dollop of pineapple filling on half of each one of the dough circles. Wet the bottom edge of the circles with an egg glaze to help seal the 2 halves, and then fold over the dough to cover the filling and seal the edges with a fork, pressing down along the edges or using a pastry cutter. Repeat with remaining dough and filling. Brush each empanada with egg glaze, sprinkle with raw sugar if you're using it. Puncture the top of each empanada with a fork to allow steam to escape while baking. Place parchment paper on a cookie sheet and place the empanadas on the parchment paper and bake for 15 to 20 minutes on the middle rack in the oven. If after 15 minutes you notice that the bottoms of the empanadas are starting to brown, move the cookie sheet to the top rack and continue to bake for the last 5 minutes until golden brown. I prefer these still warm from the oven, and I think you will too. Enjoy! This just in. The most exciting time of the year is upon us at the Edgewood Congregational Church, the annual Holiday Bazaar. November 18th, 2023 from 9 a.m. to 2 p.m. This year is bigger than ever. Lydia's Closet, the thrift store, has been collecting all sorts of really useful items, stunning jewelry, clothing, and that's just them. We are filled to the brim with vendors. Food vendors you may recognize from the farmer's market. The Pawtuxet General itself will be chock full of pies to sell. The bazaar will have games for the kids and Pinball from Electromagnetic Pinball Museum and Restoration. Come join us November 18th, 2023 from 9 a.m. till 2 p.m. I'll meet you there. I want to tell you about my friend Mike and his electromagnetic pinball museum and restoration arcade. It's an all-inclusive place to relax and share anything related to modern pinball and arcade games. A group of pinball and arcade fans with an addiction to games of all kinds and Lego too. $10 gets you free play on pinball and arcade games all day. You can find them at 881 Main Street, Pawtucket, Rhode Island, or online at www.electromagneticpinballmuseum.com. And now in our continuing House in the Corner series, The Masque of the Red Death by Edgar Allan Poe. The Red Death had long devastated the country. No pestilence had ever been so fatal, so hideous. Blood was its avatar and its seal, the redness and the horror of blood. There were sharp pains and sudden dizziness, and then profuse bleeding at the pores with disillusion. The scarlet stains upon the body, and especially upon the face of the victim, were the best pan which shut him off from aid and from the sympathy of his fellow man. And the whole seizures, progress, and termination of the disease were the incidents of half an hour. But the Prince Prospero was happy and dauntless and sagacious. When his dominions were half depopulated, he summoned to his presence 1,000 hale and light-hearted friends from among the knights and dames of his court, and with these retired to the deep seclusion of one of his castelled abbeys. This was an extensive and magnificent structure, the creation of the prince's own eccentric yet august taste. A strong and lofty wall girded it in. This wall had gates of iron. The courtiers, having entered, brought furnaces and massy hammers and welded the bolts. They resolved to leave means neither of ingress or egress to the sudden impulses of despair or the frenzy from within. The abbey was amply provisioned. With such precautions, the courtiers might bid defiance to contagion. The external world could take care of itself. In the meantime, it was folly to grieve or to think. The prince had provided all the appliances of pleasure. There were buffoons, there were improvisatori, there were ballet dancers, there were musicians, there were beauty, there was wine. All these in security were within. Without was the Red Death. It was toward the close of the 5th of the 6th month of his seclusion, and while the pestilence raged most furiously abroad, that the Prince Prospero entertained his 1,000 friends at a masked ball of the most unusual magnificence. It was a voluptuous scene, that masquerade. But first let me tell you of the rooms in which it was held. There were 7, an imperial suite. In many palaces, however, such suites form a long and straight vista, while the folding doors slide nearly to the walls on either hand, so that the view of the whole extent is scarcely impeded. Here the case was very different, as might have been expected from the Duke's love of the bazaar. The apartments were so irregularly disposed that the vision embraced a little more than one at a time. There was a sharp turn at every 20 or 30 yards, and at each turn a novel effect. To the right and left, in the middle of each wall, a tall and narrow Gothic window looked out upon a closed corridor which pursued the windings of the suite. These windows were of stained glass whose color varied in accordance with the prevailing hue of the decorations of the chamber into which it opened. That at the eastern extremity was hung, for example, in blue, and vividly blue were its windows. The second chamber was purple with its ornaments and tapestries, and here the panes were purple. The third was green throughout, and so were its casements. The fourth was furnished and lighted with orange, the fifth with white, the sixth with violet. The 7th apartment was closely shrouded in black velvet tapestries that hung all over the ceiling and down the walls, falling in heavy folds upon the carpet of the same material and hue. But in this chamber only, the color of the windows failed to correspond with the decorations. The panes here were scarlet, a deep blood color. Now, in no one of the 7 apartments was there any lamp or candelabrum amid the profusion of golden ornaments that lay scattered to and fro or descended from the roof. There was no light of any kind emanating from lamp or candle within the suite of the chambers. But in the corridors that followed the suite, there stood opposite to each window a heavy tripod bearing a brazier of fire that projected its rays through the tinted glass and so glaringly illuminated the room. And thus were produced a multitude of gaudy and fantastic appearances. But in the western or black chamber, the effect of the firelight that streamed upon the dark hangings through the blood-stained panes was ghastly in the extreme, and produced so wild a look upon the countenances of those who entered that there were few of the company bold enough to set foot into its precincts at all. It was in this apartment also that there stood against the western wall a gigantic clock of ebony. Its pendulum swung to and fro with a dull, heavy, monotonous clang. And when the minute hand had made the circuit of the face, and the hour was to be stricken, there came from the brazen lungs of the clock a sound that was clear and loud and deep and exceedingly musical, but so peculiar of note and emphasis that at the lapse of the hour the musicians of the orchestra were constrained to pause momentarily in their performance to hearken to the sound. And thus the waltzers perforce ceased their evolutions, and there was a brief disconcert of the whole gay company. And while the chimes of the clock yet rang, it was observed that the giddiest grew pale, and the more aged and sedate passed their hands over their brows, as if in confused reverie or meditation. And when the echoes had fully ceased, a light laughter at once pervaded the assembly. The musicians looked at each other and smiled, as if at their own nervousness and folly, and made whispering vows, each to each other, that the next chiming of the clock should produce in them no similar emotion. And then, after the lapse of 60 minutes, which embraced 3,600 seconds of the time that flies, and came yet another chiming of the clock, and then were the same disconcert and tremulousness and meditation as before. But in spite of these things, it was a gay and magnificent revel. The tastes of the Duke were peculiar. He had a fine eye for colors and effects. He disregarded the decora of mere fashion. His plans were bold and fiery. His conceptions glowed with barbaric luster. There are some who would have thought him mad. His followers felt that he was not. It was necessary to hear and see and touch him to be sure that he was not. He had directed in great part the movable establishments of the 7 chambers, upon occasion of this great fete, and it was his own guiding taste which had given character to the masqueraders. Be sure they were grotesque. There was as much glare and glitter and piquancy and phantasm much as there had been seen in Hermione. There were arabesque figures with unsuited limbs and appointments. There were delirious fancies, such as madmen fashions. There was much of the beautiful, much of the wanton, much of the bizarre, something of the terrible, and not a little of that which might have excited disgust. To and fro in the 7 chambers there stalked, in fact, a multitude of dreams, and these, the dreams, writhed in and about, taking hue from the rooms, causing the wild music of the orchestra to seem like an echo of their steps. And anon there strikes the ebony clock which stands in the hall of the velvet. And then, for a moment, all is still, and all is silent, save the voice of the clock. The dreams are stiff frozen as they stand, but the echoes of the chime die away. They have endured but an instant, and a light half-subdued laughter floats after them as they depart. And now again the music swells, and the dreams live and writhe to and fro more merrily than ever. taking hue from the many-tinted windows through which stream the rays from the tripod. But to the chamber which lies the most westwardly of the seven, there are now none of the maskers who venture, for the night is waning away, and there flows a ruddier light through the blood-colored panes and the blackness of the sable drapery apples. And to him whose foot falls upon the sable carpet, there comes from the near clock of ebony a muffled peal more solemnly empathetic than any that reaches their ears who indulge in the more remote gaieties of the other apartments. But these other apartments were densely crowded, and in them beat feverishly the heart of life, and the revel went roaringly on, until at length there commenced the sounding of midnight upon the clock. And then the music ceased, as I have told, and the evolutions of the waltzers were quieted, and there was an uneasy cessation of all things as before. But now there were 12 strokes to be sounded by the bell of the clock, and thus it happened, perhaps the more of thought crept, with more of time, into the meditations of the thoughtful among those who revelled. And thus too it happened, perhaps, that before the last echoes of the last chime had utterly sunk into silence, there were many individuals in the crowd who had found leisure to become aware of the presence of a masked figure who had arrested the attention of no single individual before. And the rumor of this new presence having sprung itself whisperingly around, there arose at length from the whole company a buzz or murmur expressive of surprise, then finally of terror, of horror, of disgust. In an assembly of phantasms such as I have painted, it may well be supposed that no ordinary appearance could have excited such sensation. In truth, the masquerade license of the night was nearly unlimited, and bearing of the stranger, but the figure in question had out-Heroded Herod, and gone beyond the bounds of even the prince's indefinite decorum. There are chords in the hearts of even the most reckless that cannot be touched without emotion. Even the utterly lost, to whom life and death are equally jests, there are matters which no jest can be made. The whole company, indeed, seemed now deeply to feel that in the costume and bearing of the stranger neither wit nor propriety existed. The figure was tall and gaunt, and shrouded from head to foot in vestments of the grave. The mask, which concealed its visage, was made so nearly to resemble the countenance of a stiffened corpse that the closest scrutiny must have had difficulty in detecting the cheat. And yet all this might have been endured, if not approved, by the mad revellers around. But the mummer had gone so far as to assume the type of the Red Death. His vesture was dappled in blood, and his broad brow, with all the features of the face, was besprinkled with the scarlet horror. When the eyes of Prince Prospero fell upon the spectral visage, which with a slow and solemn movement, as if more fully to sustain its role, stalked to and fro amongst the waltzers, he had seemed to be convulsed in the first moment with a strong shudder, either of terror or distaste, but in the next his brow reddened with rage. "Who dares," he demanded hoarsely of the courtiers who stood near him, "who dares insult us with this blasphemous mockery? Seize him and unmask him, that we may know who we have to hang at sunrise from the battlements." It was in the eastern or blue chamber in which stood the Prince Prospero as he uttered these words. They rang throughout the 7 rooms loudly and clearly, for the prince was a bold and robust man, and the music had become hushed at the waving of his hand. It was the blue room where stood the prince, with a group of pale courtiers by his side. At first, as he spoke, there was a slight rushing movement of this group in the direction of the intruder, who, at the moment, was also near at hand, and now, with deliberate and stately step, made closer approach to the speaker. But from a certain nameless awe with which the mad assumptions of the mummer had aspired the whole party, there were found none who put forth hand to seize him, so that, unimpeded, he passed within a yard of the prince's person, and while the vast assembly, as if with one impulse, shrank from the centers of the rooms to the walls, he made his way uninterruptedly, but with the same solemn and measured step that he had distinguished him from the first, through the blue chamber to the purple, through the purple to the green, through the green to the orange, through this again to the white, and even thence to the violet, ere a decided movement had been made to arrest him. It was then, however, that the Prince Prospero, maddening with rage and the shame of his own momentary cowardice, rushed hurriedly through the 6 chambers, while none followed him on account of the deadly terror that had seized upon them all. He bore aloft a drawn dagger, and he had approached in rapid impetuosity to within 3 or 4 feet of the retreating figure, when the latter, having attained the extremity of the velvet apartment, turned suddenly and confronted his pursuer. There was a sharp cry, and the dagger dropped gleamingly upon the sable carpet, upon which instantly afterward fell prostrate in death the Prince Prospero. Then, summoning the wild courage of despair, a throng of the revelers at once threw themselves into the black apartment, and seizing the mummer, whose tall figure stood erect and motionless in the shadow of the ebony clock, gasped in unutterable horror at finding the grave cerements and corpse-like mask which they had handled with so violently a rudeness, untenanted by any tangible form. And now was acknowledged the presence of the Red Death. He had come like a thief in the night, and one by one dropped the revelers in their blood-bedewed halls of the revel, and died each in a despairing posture of his fall. And the life of the ebony clock went out with the last of the gay, and the flames of the tripods expired, and darkness, and decay, and the Red Death held illimitable dominion over all. Thank you once again for joining us today at the Pawtuxet General. If you would like to reach out with a question, comment, or local ghost story, our email is jess@pawtuxetgeneral.com. Please reach out. We can't wait to hear from you, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. But until then, I'll meet you right back here next time at the Pawtuxet General. A Something for Posterity production, pre-recorded in Pawtuxet.